in order to be able to tap the maximum potential. The context here is obviously, and Mr. Kelly alluded to this on the next slide, the road to net zero. Apologies for the headlines here. There's obviously a problem. You can see on the charts, our energy system decreases in the horizon. We need to be consuming less energy. We need to be consuming energy better, but a lot more electricity within that. The electricity system doubles in size according to the modeling from the European Commission, and wind represents half of all the electricity we consume. You can see onshore wind in dark blue here and offshore wind in light blue. The International Energy Agency might quibble here, see a bit more of a role for offshore winds, but the direction of travel is very clear. Lots of electricity and lots of wind in that mix. But where's this 450 gigawatt going to come from? And this is my final framing slide here. We clearly need to go to the areas where the resource is most competitive. And what you can see on the slide here is that the areas in blue and dark blue in particular are the most cost competitive in terms of deploying offshore winds. There are a lot of load centers, demand centers in industrialized countries, for example, in Germany, where the picture is pretty mixed in terms of the offshore wind resource. Before long, Germany will have tapped its offshore wind potential, and we're going to need to go elsewhere in order to max out. Obviously, as you can see here, is that Ireland has phenomenal offshore wind resource, and that needs to be exploited to the fullest. But again, this will require sorting things out in terms of infrastructure, market arrangements, and our relationship in terms of energy and climate with the UK. And this is precisely what I'd like to discuss now with our panel. Let me quickly introduce our panelists and jump right in. So we'll start on the end here with Stefano Grassi, head of cabinet of Commissioner Simpson, Ambassador Barbara Cullinane, Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland to the EU, Mr. Kelly, of course, Alistair Phillips-Davies, CEO of SSE, Sonia Towig, Secretary General of ENTSO-E, and last but not least, Christian Ruby, Secretary General of Eurelectric. So perhaps let's start with you, Stefano, with a broad question here. We saw the European ambition on the slides here for offshore winds. What are you planning for the next years in order to deliver that as the European Commission, and potentially, perhaps if you can talk about what to expect in the next couple of weeks? President von der Leyen obviously presented a new wind power package at her State of the Union speech a couple of weeks ago. So very interested to hear what your vision is for the implementation. And if you can touch on the role of Ireland in that context, that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre. Good morning, everyone. And most of all, thanks to Sean for organizing this very timely, very important meeting and for having me here. As some of you know, I am a weak spot for Ireland. Half of my family comes from Ireland, so I feel at home with the panel and the topic. And to react to Pierre's question and suggestion, where we think of the challenges for the offshore wind sector, I see two images or two numbers that immediately give you a sense or a snapshot of what we are facing. The first, when we did in 2020 the first assessment of the national energy and climate plans, the draft plans of member states, the Commission assessment was that overall those plans failed to identify the potential in the offshore wind sector. And therefore we came out with, in November, a few months after that assessment, with the first offshore energy strategy, where we set out what we thought at the time were very ambitious targets, 60 gigawatt by 2030 and 300 gigawatt by 2050. Now, you fast forward a few years, you go to the picture in Ostende, you take the numbers that were announced by member states in the first exercise of regional sea basing identification of the potential for offshore wind, and you see a target of 110 gigawatt by 2030 and more than 317, if I'm correct, for 2050. So numbers which are multiples, are much higher than what we had imagined just 3 years before. But when you turn this number into the pace at which installation and new generation assets should be installed, you see that last year, I think we had a maximum of 1.6 gigawatt or something like that. And if we want to reach the targets that I just mentioned, we need 10 times more of that. We need between 12 and 16 gigawatt per year. So first challenge, I think, is sustaining the pace of deployment. The second number, and it's a striking number, if you look at 2020, the data on the manufacturing of wind turbines in Europe, European manufacturers had 53% of the production overall. You now move to 2023 is 35%. Take the same numbers for China in 2020. They had, I think, 23%. They are today at 52% of the global market. So you take 3 years, you see how fast the progression was. So the two snapshots for me means two things. What, as a Commission, we have in front of us are two challenges. The challenges of deployment and the challenges of manufacturing and supply chains to underpin and sustain that deployment. So what we can do for that, because when we look at the work done and the 30 actions in the offshore strategy, most of them we have delivered. But I think Sean Kelly was extremely right to say that maybe some of the challenges for deployment now are not in rule setting, are not in targets. They are in the practical implementation. They are maybe in areas less visible. First of all, the permitting. Again, we have numbers that are 80 gigawatt of projects waiting in the pipeline for authorization. Sometimes we have from 3 to 7 years for offshore projects and even more. So I think we have addressed these through a number of measures. We have the RED III, we have the permitting emergency regulation with acceleration areas, the maximum time limits. We have a recommendation, but I think the work to be done now is really to go to member states, to administration, as Sean was mentioning, make sure they have the right people, they should have the right resources to support digitalization, to help reduce them, the number of papers to be submitted for any authorization. So I think there is a lot of work to sharing best practices, helping with digitalization, technical assistance to really get results on the ground. The second area, and I think Sonia will say it very clearly, it's the grid connection. That's also a very important area to make move things faster. And the third area, just to give you a snapshot that we see, is regional cooperation. There is a lot that can be done in order, again, to work on the visibility of the future auctions, to work on the maritime strategy, maritime planning, the identification of areas. A lot of projects with high potential are projects that are cross-border. So absolutely we need to cooperate. North Sea is very advanced, but we need to do it in the Baltic, in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, etc. On the, I try not to be too long, but there is so much to say. On the manufacturing side, yes, the President announced a European wind power package. I think we know quite clearly what is needed to give a signal to the sector and a support in a critical moment, as I said, to avoid that we are progressively losing shares. I think we are heading for something to be published by the end of October. So relatively fast. And the areas where we think we need to intervene is the auction design, is the acceleration of permitting, the issue of financing, the issue also of tackling a number of unfair, aggressive commercial practices that we see happening in a number of European markets. Where Ireland stands in all of that is not only, in our view, a country with a lot of potential, and I think very ambitious targets. I think 5 of fixed bottom and 2 of floating by 2030. But I think they are also playing their cards well in terms of leadership. They are the successful presidency of the ANZAC. They, I think, rightly put a lot of emphasis on the issue of maritime planning and on the issue of ports and preparation of our ports. And I think Ireland, for me, is making the right choice in investing in wind because I see a lot of impact for local supply chains. Because when you have to build installations, Alistair will explain us, there is a lot of local content. You need the local ports to transport, you need workers. Sometimes you cannot really transport for thousands of kilometers some components or something will have to be built locally. So I think it's also a great industrial choice. So I cut it short now, but if we are aware of the warning signals and of the challenges, I think we can, and we react very timely, we will be able to continue this as a very success story for Europe and for Ireland. Thank you.
All right. Stefano, thank you very much for that. Extremely clear. Madam Ambassador, we've been talking about targets, and the target of Ireland's 37 gigawatt is very ambitious. On to implementation, what are the plans basically to do that incrementally, and what challenges do you see?
Thanks, Pierre. And yes, as you say, Ireland's ambition is really probably at a scale that we haven't seen since we electrified the country. But then when you look at the map that you had earlier, and you point to the blue areas, you can see the huge potential that exists in Ireland. And we really do see it as an opportunity, not only in terms of our own energy self-sufficiency, but also to contribute to European energy self-sufficiency, as Sean mentioned. And then while we're on a path to net zero, there is this huge opportunity for local for businesses, for future-proofing our businesses, for improving our quality of life, but all in terms of the supply chain and what it can contribute to the local economy, as Stefano has touched on. We have a national climate action plan, and that sets out all the detailed actions that are required to deliver on our targets to 2030. Our overall renewable energy target for 2030 is 80% of electricity will be generated from renewables. And to achieve this, we're going to deliver at least 5 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by 2030, and then an additional 2 gigawatt of offshore capacity, which will be dedicated to the production of green hydrogen. We'll have 9 gigawatts of onshore wind, 8 gigawatts of solar power by 2030. Renewable generation, both wind and solar, will account for up to 95 to 100% at any given moment. There'll be enhanced grid development, which is another point Stefano has raised, and increased interconnection to the UK and to France by 2030. And then we will also phase out the use of coal and peat for power generation. Sean talked about how we are leaders in certain areas, and we are currently in the top 5 countries globally for installed wind capacity per capita. Onshore and offshore wind and solar power are going to continue to play this role that I talked about in decarbonising our energy sector. And while we are already a leader in connecting and integrating renewable electricity into our system, the scale and the ambition that we have under our climate action plan and as set out in European policy means that the pace and connection will have to increase very significantly. And making the most of and the most efficient use of our grid and resources is going to be key if we're going to accelerate the connection of renewables. To deliver on all of this, Pierre, we have to develop an updated offshore renewable energy development plan and a national marine area planning framework, which will set out the rights, obligations and responsibilities. It'll define the go-to areas. And this, of course, is going to have to be achieved while we protect the marine environment. And that's why in Ireland we're taking a plan-led and a state-directed approach, and that aligns with best practice internationally. So this means that we'll not only be well positioned to meet our ambitions, but it will provide greater certainty for all maritime users as to where offshore wind energy development will be located, and it will minimise the environmental impacts. To do this and to achieve our targets, the new plan will include a national marine planning framework, which is Ireland's first marine spatial plan. It involves the creation of an entirely new marine planning system, which is the Maritime Area Planning Act, or MAPA, the establishment of Ireland's offshore wind delivery task force, and that I'll come back to, and then the advancing of 2 new interconnector projects by 2030. Just in EU terms, Stefano's talked about the renewable strategy and the EU targets. And I would just note that whereas wind power is currently the only offshore renewable technology that operates on a commercial basis, the Commission does see huge potential in other areas as well, in technologies such as tidal and wave, floating solar energy, algae for biofuels. And in in terms of offshore wind power, the commercial development of floating technologies will allow the exploitation of a much wider range of potential offshore locations. And just to say that Ireland has traditionally led on ocean energy, particularly on research and development in the wave and tidal sectors. On the challenges, I think both Sean and Stefano have referred to the challenges. There's no doubt delivering on this is going to be hugely challenging, but the Irish government is very committed to acting to make sure that we can do that. And some of the challenges we face are shared across Europe, as Stefano mentioned, access to supply chain, ensuring that we have a skilled workforce in place that will allow us to design, construct and maintain the offshore wind farms. Other challenges may be more focused on Ireland or require Irish-specific solutions, such as upgrading of the port infrastructure, so that we can maximise the economic benefit for local communities in Ireland and they can participate in the supply chain. We don't have a significant history of offshore development, unlike a number of other countries that you've mentioned and pointed to. And so in some respects, we have had to work very quickly to get up to speed. And while work had been ongoing to facilitate offshore renewable energy rollout, such as marine planning and consenting and grid development, an initial challenge for us was to bring together a coherent whole of government approach. And in April of 2022, Minister Ryan established the Offshore Wind Delivery Task Force to do this, and that's what I mentioned. And I think that's really what's key now, is that there is a whole of government approach to this in Ireland. There's buy-in right across the political spectrum to deliver on this because of the huge potential that we have in Ireland to do it. So this task force is working together to address all of the issues in a cohesive, in a coherent way. And it includes all the government departments and agencies that are vital to the rollout of offshore wind. And that's in policy areas responsible for planning, for ports, development, further and higher education to make sure we have the skill sets domestically and that we're training people up in the key areas that we will need. Public expenditure is also involved. And this task force has developed an offshore wind energy programme, and that's a system-wide plan for the delivery of our ambition. And they're working through all the various challenges in a very concrete and coherent way to address them. And then just a final point to mention in terms of overcoming these challenges, it's the international dimension. It's cooperation with the Commission and our EU partners. You talk about the North Seas Energy Cooperation and the recent MOUs that we've had with the British government. Working with all of our partners, I think, is going to be very important in delivering on this as well. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I'm certainly convinced, but I'd like to hear from Alistair. Obviously, you're building the largest offshore wind farm in the world, Dogger Bank, at 3.6 gigawatts. You're looking at Europe more broadly, Asia Pacific, the US, and Ireland. Of course, you've got a pipeline of 800 megawatt there. How do you look at the Irish targets? How deliverable are they, and are you reassured by what you just heard?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much indeed for all the panelists for joining us here today. So I think the Irish ambition is laudable. They have a huge resource, exactly as we've heard, we've seen from the slides, and we've heard from the ambassador as well. Ireland certainly took a leading position in terms of what it did in onshore wind. In offshore wind, it has taken more time, while going for large spatial plans, going back to overall plans. will hopefully yield greater success overall. It's probably slowed up initial development. We've certainly seen challenges throughout the world at the moment. We've got significant challenges everywhere with reaching financial close because of issues around interest rates, cost of capital, and also supply chain disruptions. We heard some talk earlier about supply chain within Europe. A lot of the companies operating within Europe, and specifically Siemens Gamesa, Vestas, and GE, and others, all of them have been suffering losses in their renewables and wind businesses, and that's something that needs to be reversed. We've seen a huge drop in the costs of both onshore and offshore winds over the last decade plus, and that's particularly driven on the back of COVID. Has now gone into reverse. You can still deploy wind at far cheaper prices than we're having to pay to import very, very carbon intensive LNG and things of that nature. But we have to recognise that we have to invest now in plants and projects which, although they're more expensive than we might have hoped going back a year or two, they're still way, way cheaper than whatever we have going forward. So if I turn specifically to the Irish targets, which I think are great to see, 5 gigawatts by 2030, that can be done, but we definitely need to see acceleration on planning, consenting, and indeed economic models as well. The recent Irish auction was a big success where they got 3 gigawatts away. Interestingly, neither ourselves nor ESB, the two major utilities on the island of Ireland, won anything in that particular auction. In some senses, that's good because we've still got projects that are there. In the other sense, I would note that clearly recently, in many jurisdictions, a lot of major companies have been handing back contracts that they've won in these auctions. And I think an interesting question that I keep posing to politicians of all colours and from all countries is an auction successful because you've given a contract to somebody, or is an auction successful because you've actually built an asset that gets some green energy on the grid? And that is a major challenge, I think, for politicians across Europe and across the world at the moment. I think in the first 6 months of this year and the previous 12 months, there were no major international offshore wind farms went to financial close anywhere on the planet outside of China, and that's obviously a slightly different and strange market. So I think a lot of challenges there. I think the Irish government will need to accelerate into their current processes, having now decided exactly how they want to proceed, and we've heard the clear, ambitious plans and a lot of hard work that's been put in order to get 5 gigawatts actually built by 2030 will take a huge amount of effort. Fortunately, there are a lot of international companies standing ready to go and invest in the moment. But I think one of the things I would caution, we've obviously seen a recent round in the UK, the last round of offshore wind auction, where there were no bidders for that because prices were capped too tightly. And equally, the previous round, which was filled up, a number of the bidders, one, Vattenfall pulled out and recently wrote off 480 million euros of their portfolio. Ørsted, who've just written off about £2 billion over in their US portfolio, are obviously questioning whether they'll end up building their intended UK wind farm. So there are a lot of challenges out there for commercial companies. As I say, fortunately for ESB and ourselves, we still stand in the wings. We're pleased that we're still getting good engagement with the Irish government, with the regulators there on our 800 megawatt Arklow project. We're looking at other ways to fund that. And I think with governments, we'll need to be inventive wherever we are in Europe in terms of how you get to funding and how we actually set prices. The main thing that I would encourage people to look at is what is the current forward price of energy? What are you prepared to pay today to try and get far greener energy, far more secure energy supplies, to stop having to rely on imports of LNG from far off places that you may decide you don't want to deal with going forward. Optimistic about where we go, but I suspect if governments want to get deployment, they're going to have to listen to companies who have billions of pounds worth of money to invest and what's going on. And the final point on the short-term targets, our major partner in the UK, that's also Europe's largest producer of gas, recently exited the Irish market because of some of the slowdowns that happened there, which is obviously disappointing for us, and I'm sure disappointing for them as well. So real engagement with parties who've got a track record of investing and delivering projects like we have, and people kindly acknowledge we're just finishing our second largest wind farm off the coast of Scotland. That's the deepest tethered wind farm anywhere in the world. We've deployed about 90 foundations and are deploying the first turbines at Dogger Bank A, which is the first third of the largest offshore wind farm in the world that we intend completing by 2026. And we have a number of other developments that we've done previously as well, like Beatrice and Greater Gabbard. So I think engaging with the people who've actually got track records and listening to what we're saying about costs is going to be critical. Essentially, we only have just over 6 years left before we hit 2030. That's not very long in terms of consenting, planning, building, putting together supply chains. Supply chains are incredibly tricky to deal with at the moment. Actually getting people to decide that they want to build transmission lines or give you turbines at sensible prices is not an easy task at the moment. I think longer term, you've obviously got extraordinary plans out there. I think generally Ireland faces some of the issues that UK and other countries face as well, which is how do we balance off renewables with secure forms of energy as well. It was really pleasing to hear about the target of 2 gigawatts for hydrogen over in Ireland. Nobody anywhere in Europe really has developed a credible hydrogen policy yet. Germany is certainly leaning into that very, very heavily. The UK was, but is, I think, yet to show that it's got the leadership it had a year or two ago. And so it'll be interesting to see whether we get any of these projects off the ground. We've got 2 or 3 projects that we're trying to get off the ground in the UK, where we do have some government funding, where we're combining green electrolyzers, underground gas storage or hydrogen storage caverns, together with 100% hydrogen burning turbines from manufacturers like Siemens, to try and demonstrate that this technology is credible and deliverable at a group level. I think interconnectors will be incredibly important to Ireland. It has a huge resource. If it builds out that resource, if it goes from the 5 gigawatts and accelerates towards the 37 gigawatts, that far outstrips the demand that you'll see in Ireland, but then its ability to be able to utilise the interconnectors it takes at the moment from the UK and export energy or put energy the other way down those interconnectors, and the interconnectors, but certainly the one that I'm aware of that's potentially going to France as well, and then finally look at how it integrates itself into a hydrogen grid. Ireland has one disadvantage there: it's not heavily industrialized, and so use of things like carbon capture technology in industrial clusters is less economically compelling, and so therefore making sure that it's part of probably a grid that hopefully will include the UK, but also look to the EU more widely would be important going forward. And I think the one final thing I say is, as we do start to get more success on deploying offshore wind, looking at carbon capture and hydrogen technology will be important. We do need to make sure that when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we can still provide energy to consumers across, obviously, the island of Ireland and more widely across Europe. I'll end it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to go straight to you, Christian, to comment on this investment signal point. Alistair talked about Vattenfall, Ørsted putting projects on pause, doing write-downs. How do we get back on track?
So I think it's been mentioned that we've been in a process of, I would say, unprecedented policy development over the past few years with a whole host of really, really valuable and good legislation coming out of the Commission. But if we continue now, it's really critical that we also come to a point where we wrap some of this up and start implementing it. That's really a key point. That said, we've also heard about some of the ailments of the wind industry, and I think there is a case for asking the question: what is it that's not going well right now? Why is it that the supply chain in Europe is falling apart? Why is it that people are pulling out of the big projects? We've heard some firsthand experience already. So on the let's say, ongoing legislation, I'll just reiterate the point. It's critical now that we wrap up what we have, that we really start implementing and getting all this stuff to work. When we analyze what is out there and what could be helpful, a lot of it is in directives that have been adopted or are very close to adoption, but not yet transposed or implemented. So that is really a critical point. Then we have the ongoing market reform that I would say hopefully is coming to its conclusion. We still need to close a few critical items on this, but we do see an opportunity for doing something also for the wind industry in the context of the market design review, and I'd highlight three things here. First off, again, it's very, very helpful that we landed this, the proposal landed in a place where we didn't try to fundamentally reinvent the wheel and come up with a completely different market design. There needs to be some kind of stability for people with big economic responsibilities to be able to commit their money and face their investors and their boardrooms. So the fact that we have a more or less clear idea of the market design as we know it continuing is a great thing. The second thing I would say is that the focus on long-term contracts and long-term price signals in the market design has been helpful and potentially also can be helpful going forward. There was a lot of discussion about how that exactly could look, and I think we landed in a good place where we have a balance between different types of instruments, because it's very clear that going for one only would have been damaging. We have a clear example in my home country, Denmark, where we have a huge pipeline of big tenders and projects, and they're all based on the current scheme, which is a feed-in premium. Would you now mandate from the Commission side that this now needs to be shifted to CFDs? Again, you lose 2 years where the local government needs to reprogram, find out how that's going to go. So a diversity of different support schemes and a certain level of continuation is very good. The last thing that we do see as a good thing in the context of the market design for offshore wind is the transmission access guarantees that can really help get some clarity on the ability to be able to connect for the developers. So that's something we want to keep and basically develop more in detail the rules on how the concrete scheme could look. Then I would say the last thing, where the pain really seems to be for the moment is in the context of the auctions. We see one auction fail after the other. We see so-called successful auctions basically turn into failures because the companies pull out, as we just heard. What is it we can do there? And again, here we need to find a balance, because there's a temptation, of course, now to look a lot at non-price criteria and biodiversity, made in Europe. There are a lot of temptations in there. We just need to keep, let's say, the goal in mind. And it seems to me that sometimes in recent years, policymakers have lost track of what is the goal with a tender for offshore wind. The goal is to get some wind turbines up. But if you apply a negative bidding scheme with unlimited negative bidding, and you make €1 billion for taxpayers here, well, you might have made €1 billion, but you don't get any turbines. So the temptation of making this a huge cash cow and making this a funding mechanism for hospitals and schools or whatever other legitimate political purpose you might have is something we really need to caution against. And my last word on the tenders would be, again, whatever is done now from EU level, make sure that there's a certain amount of continuity, a sharp shift towards, and I would say that on behalf of the developers, a sharp shift towards European turbines only. Would that really help? Would we get more wind parks up in the short term. I see the point. We need to make sure that we continue to have a thriving industry, but an extreme move towards shutting out foreign producers. Be careful, I would just say. And the same goes for the non-price criteria. Let's not make them overly restrictive, so at the end of the day you have 10 different policy objectives with the wind auction. The objective should remain, let's get those wind turbines up and running. Thank you.
Indeed, right? Let's deploy, but let's also design a policy that maintains the buy-in of Europeans, and obviously having a strong, vibrant supply chain here in Europe will be critical to that end. Okay, Sonia, I mean, it's been touched on various times here already. None of this is possible without the transmission grids, right? So I'd like to hear you a little bit on that. You don't need to comment specifically on the tag, which Christian mentioned, but you can if you'd like to do it. And any reflections on the fact that on what you expect here from the European Commission? It's been said multiple times that we really need to focus on implementation. I think there's a notable exception here, which is perhaps switching gears on grid deployments, grid management, grid optimization. Yeah, any thoughts on that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you to Sean Kelly for a nice hosting of such a nice event, Ambassador Conan, and also my distinguished panelists. So I have also the opportunity to have listened to you to also react to some of your points. So I think very much Ireland is certainly in my heart. I spent most of my career implementing EU law, and implementation now being the focus is actually quite an important realization in Brussels and in Europe, that we will not get there unless we accelerate, but also unless we move together on that leadership front on implementation. It is complex, it is multifaceted, it is a multi-parameter problem we're trying to solve. The grid is one part of it, and I thank also Stefano Grasti for the hosting of the event on the 7th of September, in which we discuss the challenges of grid and the energy transition. ENSOE, which is the European network of TSOs in Europe, is there to support and facilitate the energy transition. It develops network development plans for all of Europe, and in January 2024 will launch the first offshore network development plan for the whole of Europe, for the 5 sea basins around Europe. We've talked today, or you've heard today, about the sea basins in the North Sea and in the Atlantic. And of course, Ireland has a huge potential, as you see. I fully agree with ambassadors, ambitious, the need to plan those offshore potential. I have no doubt that we will obtain it. 20 years ago, Ireland was talking about integrating onshore, big time. And of course, the TSO found it also very challenging to integrate onshore. But it has overcome those challenges together with the wind industry to find what we call a new level of energy security in Ireland. We are an island economy, and therefore we need our own security endemic in an island, but also with our neighbours and our interconnections that we've talked about to both the GB, but also to France, and future plans beyond that. So we very much within ENSO, we support the need on regional cooperation, to Stefano's point. We need to work with our neighbours more closely. But when you think of the challenges that Alistair mentioned here, but also Christian, we do have a tough, challenging environment there. And we do need to work together to ensure that we can solve those challenges together and that we find the most efficient way to do so. So just a little bit about the offshore network development plans. The first will be developed in January 2024. We are working together with all ministries. Okay, this is obviously the offshore ownership of the maritime rests with government, and so therefore it is a very ambitious plan. But we're also having full support from ministries across all the sea basins. They're working very closely together as a cohesive unit. What we have done, of course, in terms of planning, is that we want to accomplish this offshore in terms of a timely delivery of the plans for accomplishing connections and grid development at least cost, keeping the system secure, accommodating a redefinition of power flow patterns. You can imagine in Europe right now how the electricity flows at any one day. And of course, we have lots of dynamic flow patterns because it's a weather-based system. Okay, fundamentally, it's a weather-based system. And of course, Ireland, as you know, everybody's been to Ireland, we talk about the weather a lot. Of course, considering non-binding member state targets, we want to take account, of course, of spatial constraints in the sea basins. It's a very important part of environmental protection and maritime law that we should work together in harmony, both from an energy perspective, but also from a maritime perspective. It is about an integrated planning perspective, and so we, as a number of objectives with regard to sector coupling and sector integration, we want to ensure that we bring the flexible resource on time and at least cost. So I do have a very strong view on the ambition and the fact that we will realize it. In terms of coping with these ambitions, of course, we need to work together. And as I've stated, we very much welcome the President von der Leyen's statement in respect of the wind power package. We very much welcome, of course, the focus on skills, on resources, on supply chains. Again, the multi-parameter problem requires us all to work together and to discuss it as one. As I said, with regard to onshore, this was the challenge 20 years ago. To integrate onshore and to bring all the stakeholders together and to find the solution that would work onshore. And we very much welcome, of course, the discussions here in Brussels and in Strasbourg on the Net Industry Act. And of course, we want to ensure that the grid development and grid focus is one of the main tenets of energy transition. The fastest way to decarbonize Europe is through electricity. And of course, the grid plays an important part on that. We want to work together with all our stakeholders to do so. So I welcome, and we welcome as NSOE, all discussion and all engagement in that regard. And so a final point with regards to, simplification of permitting. Again, my history is that I have worked on some of the big projects in Ireland, and they are also challenging to build. We are a small island. We have people like to own their land, and therefore we have to work with people who want that are impacted by the land. And that's a very important part of our role as TSO, is also to reflect that we impact people. Okay, and therefore we take care with the way in which we engage, the way in which we discuss infrastructure. And of course, I understand from a building point of view that all of the ways in which we work and the ways in which we engage are changing. And we have revamped for TSO, but also for the developers, the way in which we talk and the way in which we engage generally across many projects. And I do believe we will realize this ambition. Thank you, Pierre.
Thanks, Sonia. So I'd like to go back to you, Mr. Kelly, and perhaps hear a few reflections as an experienced member of the E-Trade committee here. What do you draw from this discussion, and what do you think are the priorities now for European policymakers in deploying renewables?
There's a consistency across the panel that we have the ambition, but we're not putting it into action quickly enough. And they have identified some of the problems. For me, the first one is planning, especially in Ireland. I think it's not fit for purpose. I said it actually 5 years ago when I was going for election, and it has got worse rather than better. The fact that we had no wind farm getting permission in the last 12 months. Something is broken and it needs to be fixed, and fixed quickly. It's great to have ambition. Obviously, without ambition, you can get nowhere. But I think the focus now, as the panel have said, has to be on implementation. And if we do that, then I think we'll make progress. Secondly, and this was identified as well in the EPPD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which I was rapporteur for, the absence of skilled workers. This is the year of skills in the European Union, and we really need to match our ambition for offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, with the type of jobs that will be needed to build and maintain. And I was in Ostend a few weeks ago with the Industry Committee in Denmark, and the amount of maintenance alone is actually mind-boggling and requires very, very well qualified people. So I think that's something I would like to see the European Union in particular at Commission level really focusing on in the next 12 months. And as well in Ireland, we have developed the technological universities now. They need to work very closely with the industries to see what's required and what we can produce in Ireland. And finally, Christian referred to the market design. I'm glad it's becoming feasible to be finalised in a practical way to guarantee stability. But essentially, to sum it up, as Christian I think put it, let's get the turbines up and running. And I'd like to see that happening. And we can, but we have to be tougher and stronger and more determined to make it happen now and get rid of the roadblocks.
And reflecting a little bit on the benefits of that, Mr. Kelly, can you expand a little bit on what that would bring the Irish economy and society?
Yeah, Barbara quite rightly outlined the opportunity that is in Ireland. I mean, the offshore wind potential is massive and our ambition is huge. But also, we have particularly in ports like Foynes and Cork, we have really top quality, deep, clean ports. And they can be perfect in servicing the offshore wind potential, which we hope to develop 37 gigawatts by 2050. But we need to start pretty quickly in ensuring that they're ready to function and to service the offshore winds which we have. And again, also, we have one other advantage. We have the Maria Institute in Ringaskiddy, where a huge amount of research has taken place and is taking place. And that's just alongside the port of Cork. So connecting all those things shows that we have massive potential, particularly in the West Coast. And I think really what people need to see now is to see action. Action, and probably also, I think what you, Barbara, mentioned about communities, and Stefano mentioned it, we need to get communities involved in as well, to show them the potential, to show what we hope to happen in due course, and to make us proud of the fact that Ireland will no longer be reliant on imported fossil fuels. We will actually be exporting electricity, and to tell communities you can all play a part, but you must come on board as well. And I think if we do that, we can create excitement and enthusiasm, and then if we put the supports behind it, it can happen and take off quickly, slow start, but it can develop quickly.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Kelly. Can we stay with you, Madam Ambassador? And specifically on communities, I think when the energy stays, the benefits are relatively clear and can be explained. When we talk about energy exports, then you start getting into certain types of trade-offs that become more complex, yeah? How do you think we collectively as industry policymakers should convey to communities that are hosting these renewable energy projects, those overhead lines, what's in it for them, and how do we build that, the benefits inside the projects?
Thanks, Pierre. Yeah, I think engaging and making sure that communities are part of the decision-making process and that they will directly benefit from these projects and their infrastructure, that is really key to successfully deploying renewable energy. Sonia talked about her experience of this in Ireland in recent decades, and I think we've learned a lot from experiences that we've had in deploying all kinds of infrastructure about engaging communities. And the community engagement, I think the importance of this has been the experience across Europe and across the world, that it's only successful when communities are engaged. I think that's why in Ireland, offshore wind farms must establish their operations and maintenance headquarters in Ireland, maximising the capture of the local economic benefit. And experience from the EU and the UK markets have shown that this mandate can breathe new life into harbour and coastal communities. Wind farms, they must also make a substantial annual direct contribution to the coastal and marine community through a community benefit fund. The Community Benefits Fund process, which has been established in Ireland, was developed in close collaboration with stakeholders, including the local communities, including with the offshore wind industry. And the development process for the funds included 2 public consultations. And this has led to a scheme which empowers community decision-making, while also ensuring that the local communities benefit from one of the highest renewable energy revenue-sharing models in the world. A key feature of the offshore funds is that generators must start making contributions from the early stages of the offshore wind project, and that is prior to commencing operations. So, in fact, I think it is 12 months after the commencement of the project, or 12 months after they sign the EPC, they have to start contributing to the Community Benefit Fund. And the reason for this is that the disruption to the local community is at its highest during the construction phase, so it's very important that the benefits are already being seen at that point. And then this means that coastal and marine communities could start to receive benefits from as early as 2025, and that this could go on for decades. And I think just an interesting feature of the fund that has been set up in Ireland is that it can only support projects that are aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's effectively supporting local community infrastructure, sports clubs, energy upgrades to local housing, scholarships, things like that. Given the contributions to these funds are going to be determined by the amount of energy that's generated, and that's €2 will be required to be paid for every megawatt hour of electricity that's generated over the lifetime of the support period. And given the anticipated high levels of offshore generation in Ireland, the amounts will be substantial. We're talking about approximately 8 million per annum from a typical 1 gigawatt offshore wind project, or almost 25 million per annum from the 3 gigawatt capacity contracted under the recent ORES. And then another final point on the community fund is that a register has been created, and this register is going to be open and transparent, and anybody can consult it. So communities can see interesting projects that are showcased. They can learn from what others have done and maybe replicated in their own areas. And the key point here is that it's the community itself that will decide what the funding is spent on. They will decide what are the priority projects in their area that the money will go to. And then just the final point, picking up on what Sean has talked about in terms of the economic opportunities for the local community and building supply chains and skill sets and providing jobs in areas very often outside of the main cities. I think we do recognise that the wind resource is the scale of the opportunity in terms of regional development potential is enormous. And when you look at the map, and you can see where the potential lies around the country. And so that's why our Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment is developing a national industrial strategy for offshore wind to ensure that we can maximise the economic benefits associated with our offshore targets. And this involves building the supply chain domestically in local communities. And aligned with this strategy, we have developed our regional enterprise plans, and they provide a forum for stakeholder collaboration, and this includes offshore wind and coastal regions. And this is all about the upskilling, the retraining of people from adjacent industries to make sure that they can find employment in these industries of the future. It's about working with all of our institutes that Sean's talked about. Our Ministry of Further and Higher Education is working through part of these plans, identifying all the skills that will be required and the number of people we will require trained up in each area to deliver on these objectives, to make sure that we're training them up for the future. So I think really, as you can see, the whole community and the benefits for the community, building on the experience that we've had, as Sonia has mentioned, this really is key in developing our renewable energy resources, and also just in terms of developing this local enterprise and business opportunity and employment opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, for sharing those plans and thoughts. Stefano, I'd like to come back to this issue of exports here, because as we saw on the map, the big demand centers are not necessarily where the offshore wind resource is the most abundant. And in order to basically get the most out of that whole of Europe experience and maximize on the potential of offshore wind, a number of things need to happen, in particular around infrastructure, but not only. So how do we connect the potential supply and the demand? What can the European Commission do about that in the coming months and years?
There's just one maybe surprising qualification when we talk about exports. I think we are talking about European cross-border exchanges, because I think to some extent Europe will always remain an open continent, open to trade, open to imports and trade of energy commodities. But I think the essence of what we are doing with REPowerEU, with our clean tech, clean energy transition, is not just to react to a crisis determined by a geopolitical event, but it's really to build a more secure and greener energy system where a lot of homegrown energy sources with a focus on home energy sources. Today, if you look at some of European countries, more than 80% of the energy is coming from outside Europe, and we have a huge import bills. So I think one of the benefits and one of the stories of our clean energy transition to 2040 will be to turn Europe in a more independent, more sovereign energy continent, more able to make, to control its own choices. I think overall, we hope that by 2040 we'll be able on aggregate in Europe to all import 30% of our energy. Now, this means that we need to maximize, of course, cross-border exchanges within the European continent, within the European Union, and with reliable partners. I think important choices there we already made in terms of regional cooperation, and Sonia mentioned it, is the issue of offshore network grid planning cross-border. I think we need to bring some clarity and some guidance on the way the cost-benefit sharing is done for cross-border projects, because clearly there is a misalignment of incentives if the generation is located in some countries or some communities with cost and inconvenience linked to all of that, but most or part or significant part of those benefits is then going to very distant communities, very distant continental member states, for instance. So there is a need to have a fair, objective cost sharing in order to keep the incentives to build generation to the scale that we need for the benefits of all. It's a very complex issue. We are working with a study. We hope to have a guidance after a lot of consultation with stakeholders, maybe beginning or mid next year to the latest. But I think it's also a very important element. Very important element is also, we mentioned already under 10E, the regional cooperation, the sea basin cooperation on targets, on maritime planning. But if I may just conclude with, then also I think under 10E, an important element is the single one-stop shop for permitting. So for cross-border projects, the ability to have only one place where all the procedures can be merged into one and facilitate authorizations. But if I may conclude with two elements on what can help additional rollout of offshore, and to pick up on what Alistair was saying. Two of the most acute problems that we see now are, as you mentioned, the risk that the auctions are leading to negative or very, very low prices. So a lot of uncertainty about forward prices, about what the remuneration, and it can be taken from the projects. And second, the cost and the disruption of the supply chain, but also the risk that some participants to the auctions are gaming the system and are maybe bidding at a certain level, which with no intention, or then with the second thought of pulling out of the projects if then the execution becomes too costly, or their calculus is changing over time. And now the point that I wanted to make is that we should look at the electricity market design reform not only as a very technical piece of regulation on price setting, price formation, protection of consumers, long-term markets, etc., market infrastructure, but also as an enabler. Because here, for instance, let's imagine how much predictability and stability we can give to generators and project promoters if we are indeed using much more, in a much more harmonized way, in a much more structural and systemic way, contracts for difference, for new generation, or for repowering and power purchase agreements. That's a great issue for us, a great response to the issue of missing money. And second, again, imagine we are talking here about design or auction design issues, or for instance, penalties for non-execution, or the indexation issue. I see in the current text of Electricity Market Design, Article 19, entire paragraphs about the design of contracts for difference with regard to the use of remuneration, etc. Why not take this as a vehicle for fixing some of the issues that Alistair was mentioning? We have a vehicle there, it's in council, Parliament has taken a position, while we are not yet in the trilogue. Why not? Why not a bit more courageous? Net Zero Industry Act as well. I understand the point made by Eurelectric on Christian on the balance we need to do with regard to trade policy. But again, we have an important article on the sustainability and the resilience criteria there. If we have issues on the pre-qualification criteria for procurement and for auctions, why don't we look at that article and make it in an intelligent way, slightly more punchy than it is. And second, to conclude, we have. I come from a tradition of single market studies, and where industrial policy is mainly an horizontal policy. But when I see and we discuss the issue of the offshore wind, if I look at the hydrogen sector, the electrolyzers, and I could continue, I think what we need now in Europe is a little bit more of, again, smart, balanced, vertical industrial policy, sector by sector. The problems are different. They are sometimes very clearly defined. They seem to be small. It's the skills, is the training, is the permitting, the resources of national administration, the ports. For each of the sector, you need a really laser focus on what are the problems, and a constant attention, a policy and administrative attention to make things work. If we keep the broad brush, if we keep horizontal, we limit ourselves to the surface of horizontal policy, I think we will not give the response that's needed. So I think that through this idea of business dialogues, or with the clean text that the President announced, and the work that we are trying to do, starting now with the wind power package, we will be a bit more, I will say, determined and aggressive in this policy attention on the vertical sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Very clear on the later focus on industrial policy, sector by sector. But I want to come back, Alistair, to this energy system planning piece here. Obviously, you do electricity, but you also do gas. So your thoughts on the decarbonization roadmap of Ireland would be very helpful, and in particular as to how electricity and hydrogen are meant to interact here in order to make this work.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's clearly important that we get a flexible system moving forward. I think it's the next piece. If people are thinking about all system planning, the ambassador in Ireland talked about how they're going for much more of a spatial planning perspective now, and a central planning perspective on the system. We are definitely going to have to look at how you take all that wind energy that's being proposed and how you store it in some way, shape or form. And there can be short-term storage, although generally all the batteries that we're tending to deploy are between 1 and 4 hours, so they're not giving you any long duration storage. Hydrogen's one of the areas that people have looked at. As I said, Ireland have some unique challenges in the sense that they're not as heavily industrialized, and therefore the industrial clusters aren't there. So they don't have as much cement, steel industries that need to be decarbonised as well, where you can use carbon capture and storage. They don't have the big reservoirs or basins for storing CO2 that some other parts of Europe have. And so integrating what Ireland is doing into what the rest of Europe is doing, looking to get integration around hydrogen trains, and potentially with increasing its electricity interconnection, I think will be important, whether that is with or through the UK, and also with other parts of Europe as people build larger interconnectors. We've seen recently the longest interconnector in the world has been built between Norway and the UK, which is 792 kilometres. So you're definitely seeing much longer interconnectors coming into play, and it plays into that point about regional partners and reasonable participation. I think Ireland will find plenty of opportunities to do that. But as it moves forward with ambitious plans, and if it does start getting serious deployment of wind, it'll need to look at how it can store energy or how it can participate in more in flexible technologies, and hydrogen would certainly be one of those. As I say, I think in parts of Europe, particularly Germany, you've seen a lot of advances in that, and in the UK, you're certainly starting to see a variety of things, particularly on the east coast, and it'll be interesting on the west coast. There are big potential CO2 stores like Morecambe Bay on the east coast of the UK, and we could see hybrid interconnectors as well going through some of the big East Coast UK, East Coast Ireland and West Coast UK wind farms that are being built at the moment as well, which I think, again, will help. If you've got a long wire going out to a wind farm, there's no reason why you can't build the wire the rest of the way, whether it's either to Europe or over to Ireland. So that's something I would definitely encourage Ireland to start thinking about. At the moment, it's all about deployment, which we definitely heard from Sean in terms of how we actually make this, a year or a couple of years of deployment, and we get back on track with just getting the basic renewables there, but also then starting to think about, with all that deployment, how you maximise the use of those assets for flexibility and greater interconnection.
So Sonia, still on that, the energy system planning. How do we make sure at European level that we have a proper, energy system level approach, right? Because if I simplify to the extreme, and so you have your own exercises, which you've described very well. Your counterparts at NSOEG have their own, and then, their respective representatives try to meet somewhere in the middle, but there's not yet an energy system approach that takes us the most cost effectively and the quickest to net zero. So how does that need to change? What do you expect from political leaders in order to help steer that?
I guess it takes a lot of resourcing. It takes a lot of modeling. What we do, of course, right now is we work with multi-stakeholder interests. In terms of what we're trying to achieve now is obviously capturing what we call the prosumers, the use of as you know, there's a lot of generation at distribution level now. We also have vehicles converted to EVs. So we're modeling a lot of very different aspects down to the what I call the micro level. We have macro scenarios that we need to focus on for energy transition, for net zero, and we have micro modeling going on. So there's a lot of improvements being made to the way in which we optimize and the modeling. We're obviously trying to do this multi-sector approach, so cross-sectional, so with regard to power to gas or power to liquid. And we have, of course, working with various industries on that in terms of how we can model effectively. But we are effectively reinventing grid planning, and we're not just doing it for the benefit of the grid, but in the more broader sense of the word, of the broader economy. So it is when we talk about ambition on decarbonization, we're also talking about ambition on how we plan. And therefore, it's going to lead to some new innovations. Of course, there's technology plays an important part. And of course, we want to ensure that in the modeling that the technological advances are also an efficient and an important part. It isn't just about building new wires and new overhead lines or undergrounding them, but also in terms of deploying technology in a software sense or in an application-focused sense to avail of flexibility within day and not just over longer-term horizons. So yes, and also when we're building offshore, we should build for the future and not for just today's needs, but also for future needs. So in NSOE, we also do what we call cost-benefit analysis to look at hybrid project scenarios. If I were a consumer today or the public, I will want to know all the planning that's going to happen in my area, not just one project, but multifaceted projects. So it's really important for us at NSOE that we do capture all of those development aspects into one plan and into a plan that can be deployed and utilized by a number of both developers, but also communities, etc. Thank you.
Okay, Christian, I have a very specific question on EU-UK relations, but I think it would be helpful to hear from you also on the energy system planning points. I mean, the road of travel is, the direction of travel is very clear. We have to electrify, and Europe is not doing that right now. You've talked about it, we've talked about it. I mean, we're flatlining in terms of rate of electrification. What needs to happen? And then I promise I come back on the EU-UK question.
Where we have our focus for the moment when it comes to planning is a little bit less related to the offshore part and very much related to the need for a very rapid build out and reinforcement of distribution grids across Europe. When we look at the planning dimension here, I'm very intrigued and encouraged to hear that you're also doing some micro stuff. But we do see, let's say, that being the sort of the blind angle for the moment. There's a lot of granular and informed planning going on at transmission level, much less so, at least, let's say, much less so coordinated in the distribution space. And this is something that we're devoting a lot of attention to. When we look at the overall deployment patterns, we expect some 60 to 70% of new capacity to be joined directly to the distribution grids going forward. And we see the distribution grids also as the place where the heat pumps and the EVs are going to connect, which means that the dynamics of the grids will be shifting over the next years, and we need to make sure that part is properly planned. So we're looking also as an association to see what are the opportunities of ramping up the capabilities, both institutionally and on the industry side, for local grid planning and to get a better eyesight on the big picture of Europe.
Okay, so one of the positive developments that's happened recently in terms of cooperation around the North Seas has been basically welcoming back the UK certainly as an observer in this process. This, in our view, is a step in the right direction. We would, see them as becoming full members in the medium term. What are your thoughts on that, Christian, as to the ideal climate and energy cooperation between the EU and the UK?
So I think these cooperation plans where member states or individual countries work together are very useful, and there's one called the EU where I would really invite the UK back sometime soon. But before that happens, I think it's also a positive development that they're now joining the cooperation platform for the North Sea. When we look at the things that need to happen and are already happening also on the Viking Link, the Lion Link, and big infrastructure projects, it's very evident that there needs to be some fora where these things can be discussed and coordinated because a lot needs to happen and the cooperation needs to be closer in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Christian, I join your wishes. Okay, now I'd like to open the floor for questions from anyone in the room, if anyone is up for that. Okay, we've got a question. Gentlemen, if you can just identify yourself and say who the question is for on the panel. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Kyriakos Yalloglu. I work for the European Committee of the Regions. Echoing the comments about community engagement and local content, supply chains, etc., I have a question for Mr. Phillips Davis from SSE. The question is, would you consider using this EU tool policy provision in EU legislation with regard to renewable energy communities as a way of sort of engaging with local communities, giving them perhaps a very modest share of a company, of a local sort of structure for, let's say, an offshore wind farm, rather than just, well, it's not just, but it's a payment to a local fund. Would that be a possibility? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really good question. So in the UK currently, we have a lot of community funds. So I think they echo some of the comments that I've heard from our friends in Ireland here today about how they're seeing communities being brought into wind projects. So we currently pay around about £5 million to different communities, and that's we have that chaired by Lord McConnell, who was a former First Minister of Scotland, in terms of how we allocate that money out, and we report on it every year. There's about a 100-page report that we do on what's seen there. I think for us, those community funds, one, around renewable projects are important. They're also important for networks as well. I think we see a lot of communities being resistant to installation of networks, and that's probably true. In parts of Ireland, we certainly see it in some of the southern parts of the UK, and we're starting to see it in northern parts of the UK, despite the fact population density is lower. So I think any community that hosts infrastructure that is beneficial to UK, Ireland, Europe, moving forward in terms of energy independence and energy security, should have an opportunity to benefit from that. We can see that happen. I think direct ownership of companies can be tricky. We tried that on Shetland. We're currently building what's likely to be one of Europe's most productive onshore wind farms on Shetland, over 450 megawatts, with a very high load factor. And the community was involved with that for about a decade. In the end, because the costs of building that wind farm were close to £500 million, they weren't able to come up with enough money. But we certainly came up with a very, very clear package of how we were able to pay money back to the community over an extended period of time, so 25 years, to make sure that they benefited from that. And we're certainly looking at models like that within the transmission sector in the UK as well, and there have been clean calls for that, and I think that's progressive. I think wherever we go in Europe, we'd be very keen to involve ourselves with communities who host assets and to try and find models that work for in those local countries and in those local communities, to make sure that whoever hosts this kind of infrastructure does benefit from the wider benefits that it's going to bring to the entire country and the entire EU.
All right, thank you very much for that, Alistair. Any more questions from the room, please?
Yes, Geoffroy Châtenay for Ruth Pedersen Public Affairs. My question to Mr. Grassi. There is a recent International Energy Agency report that shows that the REPowerEU permitting measures that we mentioned today, sorry, which simplified some of the permitting, haven't really been used across the EU and are not really driving the uptake of some renewable projects in the Union. So because of those measures have been integrated in RED 3, I'm wondering what should policymakers do to actually circumvent this lack of political will that we can see in member states to actually facilitate really this use of simplified permitting, because as we discussed, it's going to be essential. Thank you.
I am slightly more optimistic than the other analysts, clearly, because I think we are talking about measures that we introduced last December, and I think it's a bit too early to say whether they work or they don't work fully. We have some indications on the contrary that we have a sort of advanced implementation by some of the administration. And I think even anecdotally, we were told by some market operators that the CEOs that they got a phone call from some of their reporting lines saying, I got it. What are they talking about? I got the permission. I was waiting for months and months or years, and finally I got a phone call, as if it was a news. So this, first of all, shows the level of the problem. But second, I think we see some encouraging signs that some of the administrations are taking up on these opportunities. Also in other countries that I know are more familiar with, the work on identifying the renewable acceleration areas under different names is going ahead. So I think the opportunity is being taken up. But to be taken up fully, what can be done? I think number one, there is a lot of pedagogical and explanation work that we can do, technical assistance to some of the national administrations, then for them to talk to the regional and the local administrations. Some of the responsibility for parts, at least, of a permitting or the environmental impact assessment, the screening of the documents is for very small administrations. So there is a lot of training, a lot of technical assistance. Some of the offices are overwhelmed. They have 2-3 people and they receive 50 or 60 requests for new generation projects, and they're simply overwhelmed. There is a lot of work to be done on digitalization. Again, we see now some best practices. I think Denmark is piloting a very interesting one. Again, maybe with the use of some small funding from the European Union, some, again, aggregation or sharing of best practices, we can see a multiplication of that. We would like also to use more what is called the concerted action in renewable energy sector, to bring together the administration, to really keep the pressure on implementation and regularly review. I think we can use also the 10E process. So we want to keep the pressure there, but it's a lot of methodical, precise work that still needs to be done.
Thank you very much for that, Stefano. So I think we're right on time. So I'm going to ask the panelists to stay up here before I give the word to Mr. Kelly for some concluding remarks. But if I can already ask you to join me in thanking our panel. So back to you, Mr. Kelly, for some words of conclusion.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. I found this discussion very informative, and I would like to thank the panelists for their contributions, Ambassador Barbara, Stefano, Alistair, Zania and Christian, and yourself, Pierre, for moderating. A few points which I think are important. One, I'm glad that Ireland is in the EU, because I think if we weren't in the EU, some of the problems we have wouldn't be solved. They'd be kicked down the road, or they would just continue. But I think at EU level, the legislation essentially is done for the Green Deal. It has to implement it. And I expect, especially the next Commission, will be ensuring that every member state will put pressure and demand that each country reach its targets. And that will make us and other member states deal with the logjams that are there, the bottlenecks, etc., and deliver, because that's what we're talking about. Also, I was actually the one who suggested in the renewable energy Red 3 that public interest projects, as part of the Fit for 55, would have a determined period by which planning and permitting would have to be granted. I think that's something, as Stefano said, will become more effective as we move forward, and that will help to address some of the delays which are there at the moment. One area which we haven't heard very much about in this mandate is InvestEU. Some of you might recall that after the recession, President Juncker introduced the Juncker plan, and it was hugely successful. InvestEU, and I was a rapporteur for it, is its successor, and I think I would like to see a lot more of that being utilised, particularly financing big projects which we will need of this nature. I would like to hear Christian and others elaborate on the problem of auctions. The problem of auctions at the moment is not acceptable. I mean, how often have you seen somebody in Ireland bid for a house or a farm, and then having gone through all the process, fought off all the opposition, threw it up? There has to be something seriously wrong if that happens. So the same should apply here, and I think it's something, probably, Stefano, that we need to address a little bit more at European level to see where are the problems and get rid of them, full stop. And I think what Christian said is true. There's too much emphasis on the financial benefits of auctions to build hospitals or schools, etc. The real benefit of an auction is to deliver wind turbines, if it's a wind auction. And that has to be central focus. Also, I think we have a great opportunity now for actually ensuring almost compelling delivery. Because we have an election in Ireland next year, probably, certainly before February following year. We have the European elections. We'll have a new commission. That'll be for a 5-year period, 2024, 2025 to 2029, 2030. So it's all about delivery of the 2030 targets. There is no escape. So the next government in Ireland and the next commission, how are they going to deliver year by year what they are legislated to do? And I think that symmetry is very good. If Ursula von der Leyen gets a second term, then obviously that will add more focus to it, because the Green Deal essentially was her baby. She'll be finishing in 2029-30. So did she deliver or did she not? And I think that would be certainly something that we could focus on. And finally, I just want to say, in relation to the UK, I'm the first Vice Chair of the UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly. Energy is one of the topics we'll be discussing at our next meeting in December. There's a huge positive atmosphere now that Johnson is gone and Sunak has taken over in the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly between all sides of the House in the United Kingdom, the Lords and the Commons and MEPs, and I don't see any difficulty in full cooperation here, because in many respects Brexit couldn't happen really in relation to energy, because we are in Ireland interconnected with the United Kingdom, they're interconnected elsewhere, they're involved in the North Sea cooperation, and it's just a question of letting them be involved as much as possible so that we deliver for all of Europe. So while we have problems, I think we have the resources, the wherewithal, and above all, I think the people, as we saw here today, with the knowledge to help us deliver. It's just a question of deciding. We're going to deliver by 2030. We're going to do the following year by year. I think then that will change the dynamic. So thank you very much. Thanks, Pierre, and thanks to SSE again for organising. I think we need a few more of these to get the message out there, to get people all in the one frame of mind, all moving in the right direction. Because ultimately, and I'll finish off with this point, while you can talk about communities getting money for this, that and the other thing, ultimately what we have to impress upon people is that anything you do to get rid of fossil fuels and develop renewables, you are actually saving the planet for future generations, your kids, your grandchildren and so forth. I think that has to be the key message. Everything else is secondary to that. So thank you very much.